was telling my colleagues, I was like, I have a book that's being published soon. And then I heard that one of my other colleagues had said, oh, he's lying. That's my book over there. I'm just going to sign a few copies.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, really? Full bar? Well, this is a very good idea.
You spend all day here.
What's today, the what?
The 15th at 4 on the dot.
15th. Just a little surprise.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna like pop a squat
Yeah, here.
tomorrow, where I'll be renting a car for an exorbitant price and driving back to New York City. But I'll put these back on the shelf.
We actually have
And for I think Asian American writers specifically, I think it is crucial to write about what you know, and I think that also includes the Asian American experience. Okay. All right.
And since when did you get interested in Western stories, and did you get some influence from directors like Clint Eastwood?
I love Clint Eastwood films. I think I got interested in Westerns when I went to college in California, because I hadn't really seen the West until I went to college, kind of on my own. I was actually talking to my mom about this, and I was saying, oh, I had never been to the West until college, and she said, don't you remember we took you on that vacation when you were 5 or 4? And so the answer was no, I didn't remember that. But I got interested in Westerns when I went to college in California. I got a car for the first time, and so I was kind of driving around a lot.
Among all the Western movies you have watched, have you seen any Chinese characters on the wanted list, or is Ming Su the first one?
I don't recall seeing a Western movie with a Chinese American protagonist where he's the only protagonist. And I think I wanted to tell a story where it was just a Chinese American main character, and that was the whole deal. And he got to live his own story.
And how many people have Ming Su killed? And are those people he killed all villains that deserve death in American Western story standard?
I think that's an interesting question. I think by his own count, he's killed about 200, but that was his job. He worked for this crime boss in Sacramento, Silas Root, and he was trained to be a killer. So in a sense, I think he was only doing his job, and he didn't really think about whether or not they were villains or whether or not they deserved death. And I think that question of whether someone is a villain or whether someone can even deserve to die is something that Ming grapples with throughout the course of the novel, something that he kind of comes to reckon with.
In a few sentences, could you describe for us what kind of person Ming Su is?
The real question is whether or not Ming feels that he is his own person, because I think all of his actions are the result of obligations or things that he has to do, and I see this story as he moves through the West. I see it as being a kind of a way for him to claim his own identity, and for him to kind of work in and discover who he is and who he wants to be, outside of all those obligations and things that he has to do.
And in order to make Ming the best shooter in American West, what kind of research have you made, and how long does it take?
I spent about, I would say, probably 2 years on research, and that included a lot of, library time, book stuff, just reading about the history of it, as well as field work. So I drove back and forth east and west along the Interstate 80, which tracks the Transcontinental Railroad actually quite closely. And so I drove along that highway, and I stopped and I took pictures and I took notes. And I also tried to, one of the things that's great about our obsession with the Western as a country is that we preserve all of these artifacts from the West, even now. So it was quite easy for me to find an exact replica of the gun that Ming uses, for sale in a gift shop. And I played with it at the counter. I think it was $300. I didn't buy it, but I definitely played with it a lot. And I think that's one of the things that's great about writing a Western, is that we're so obsessed with that history. It becomes very easy to, if you're doing research, it becomes very easy to actually go and participate in reenactments and recreations of that history, to kind of find out what it was like.
And did you visit many places for this novel, maybe to places like Sacramento or like Promontory Point in Utah, and how was the experience like?
The locations are in western Utah, most in Nevada, and the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. And I was actually out there a lot, kind of going back and forth, and it's such a crazy, magical place with the landscape and the geology. You feel like you are not really a part of kind of human history when you're in those landscapes. It feels like you're standing apart from all of that. Downtown Sacramento has this kind of area called Old Town, where a lot of the old buildings from that section have been preserved or kind of rebuilt. And there's also the California State Railroad Museum is in Old Town Sacramento. And I was there a lot looking at kind of their collection and their library.
About the achievements of the Chinese railroad workers at that time. And does that experience helps you in the creative process writing the novel?
Yeah, absolutely. The work that those men did is just unbelievable. They're on the summit, no electric lights. They're drilling these tunnels by hand, and some of them go on for 500 yards, the longest one. And so they have this kind of huge iron rod, maybe like 8 pounds, and it's 6 to 8 feet long, and they have it. And it's about that wide. And then behind him are 2 men who are swinging hammers, and they're trying to hit the target that's that big with 10-pound sledgehammers. And they're doing this in almost total darkness. And so if you can imagine holding that rod and just really, really hoping that your friends don't just miss the target and like smash your hands. And then after you drill this hole, which takes an hour or 2 hours, you fill it with black powder, you light a fuse, and then you have to run because it's about to explode. And they did that in just crazy temperatures, like -30. The snow would get up to 40 feet high in a season. And so they were working in kind of totally shocking conditions for so long. And what their work did was it allowed America to become what it is today. They built this railroad that connected east and west, and like that is the start of this kind of American expansion that pushes westward from the east, and it allows for trade and commerce, and also allows for like the modern America that we think of today as being totally linked from coast to coast. That's because of this railroad. You should read everything that you can, extensively. Stuff that you think is bad, you should read anyways and figure out why you think it's bad. Stuff that you think is good, you should read and figure out like how it's so good. And for, I think, Asian American writers specifically, I think it is crucial to write about what you know.
And as Ming-Shu is probably the only Chinese American Western heroes that we have seen, what kind of role does his yellow face play?
That's an interesting question. I think he's born in America, and he doesn't speak any Chinese, and yet as he moves through the story, all these people, the rest of society is always there to remind him and to kind of tell him that he is Chinese. Not Chinese American, but specifically Chinese, that he doesn't belong in this landscape, that he's not of the place. And yet, on the other hand, he knows where to get water. He knows how the desert is navigated. He knows all of these really intimate details about this land. And yet, when he contacts society, he always gets back this kind of affirmation of his Chinese identity and not of his American identity. And I think that distinction that his race is written on his face. You know, his race is visible, and that's the only thing that's visible about him, and he's kind of judged on that standard. He's marked as an other, even though he doesn't feel that. And so I think one of the things that comes up a lot is this tension between what he is perceived as being and what he feels that he is, and kind of bringing those two things together is one of the goals. All of the Chinese immigrants in the States are kind of blending together into one person. There's this racial epithet that's used to describe all of them in all the papers and the historical sources. That's John Chinaman, which is just to describe any Chinese person that shows up in any location. And it's because of this kind of flattening, this, you know, like their interchangeable approach to Chinese Americans during that time allows Ming to kind of hide in plain sight because he seems unremarkable. So because no one actually ever remembers him or, you know, thinks of him as an individual, he becomes actually a very effective killer. He actually ends up being able to hide amongst other Chinese Americans because he is viewed as so unremarkable and so non-distinct. My aim was to make a Western landscape where anything seems possible. Where the real factual parts of it are so, I think, accurately researched, and the magic is so wild that when you combine them, the hope is that some of that realism from the historical research crosses over and makes that magic seem more plausible.
So in Ming Chu's relationships, it's mostly with white women. Is there a reason why for that? And is it because during that time, probably there are like very rare Chinese women in the Europe?
Yeah, it's exactly that. So the first wave of Chinese immigration to the U.S. started at around 1850, and it was almost entirely Chinese men. And the idea was that they would come to America, make their fortunes by working for a couple of years, and then return to their hometowns rich men. In practice, that worked out for a few of them, but not for all of them. And if any Chinese immigrants here wanted to kind of, you know, if they wanted to start a family here, or if they wanted to do anything like that, they usually had to go outside of their local community because there were simply no Chinese women who had also immigrated here. I think the number was something like 10% or fewer of all the Chinese immigration to the States in the 19th century were Chinese women. And so these relationships between Chinese immigrant men and American white women actually were quite common during that time, which is, I think, an interesting fact that that doesn't really come up a lot in tellings of that history. When I was growing up, the only books that I encountered were books with white main characters or like white heroes. And so when I first started trying my hand at fiction writing, you know, in like high school, I was writing all these stories with white main characters, and I wasn't really getting anywhere. You know, I think I was trying to write an experience that I did not have.
Does your identity bear any similarities with Ming Chu? And especially, how do you see yourself during this time when there are some debates on like stirring Chinese American hatred floating in the country?
I've read this book before now, recent spike in anti-Asian hate crimes, but it's not as though anti-Asian sentiment disappeared totally and then kind of popped back into existence in the past 2 years. It's always there. It's always been there. Just in, I think, varying degrees of intensity. It's useful to think about what anti-Asian sentiment, anti-Asian racism looks like today, while also remembering the forms that it took when Asian immigrants first started coming to the United States. And I think it's helpful to realize that they have the same bones, that it hasn't changed much, because it reframes it as a problem that can't be solved by a return to normalcy. There's no pre-hate crime period that we can return to because it's always been there. And so I think what it calls for is a kind of radical realignment of our priorities when it comes to people of color and how we treat them in this country.
What are some of your future plans? Do you plan on being a literature professor or like a writer? Or
So I am finishing up my PhD in English literature at the University of Davis. I say finishing up, I just finished up my second year, so I've got a long way to go. But I would like to be a professor of English somewhere, if they'll take me. And I would also like to keep writing. I'd like to do both things. I think it's interesting to both write books and then think about them critically. And it definitely is a real mind bender to do them at the same time. But yeah, for my future plans, at least for the near future, it's just, finishing up grad school, finishing up my second book, and it's not a Western, it's science fiction, but it is going to have a Chinese American main character. I think all my books are going to have a Chinese American main character because I'm Chinese American.